Hello, everyone. It's good to be with you this morning. So today I just want to spend about an hour kind of explaining to CCBR's vision, how we got to where we are, and a bunch of what we do and the impact that we've seen, especially over the last 10 years. Because interestingly, this May is the 10th anniversary of the very first time CCBR ever hosted a summer internship. And so I'll start by explaining how I got involved in the pro-life movement, because it's probably one of the most frequent questions that I get asked is, how did you end up working full-time in the pro-life movement? It pretty much goes without saying that nobody joins university expecting to end up in the pro-life movement full-time. Most people, when they're growing up, don't look at the pro-life movement as one of the career options they're considering. And the same thing is true for me. So I was attending Simon Fraser University, completing a degree in history. And I had been considering going for my master's degree. My eventual plan was academia on the topic of history. And then it was actually during my first or second year of university when one of my professors brought up abortion. And abortion was kind of brought up as a subject that didn't need a whole lot of discussion. It wasn't seen as particularly controversial. And I grew up in a pro-life home, but I never really thought much about abortion. I think that's true for a lot of people. If you ask them what abortion is, they have an opinion on it, but they've never really thought it through carefully. That opinion has never been challenged. And that's actually one of the reasons that data tells us so many pro-lifers become pro-choice in university, because their views have never been challenged. Their views have never been solidified. And as such, their views are very susceptible to change from university professors, from their peers, as they meet strongly pro-choice people. But I remember when this professor brought up abortion, I figured, well, I'm going to Google this to see if I can find some more information on the issue. And I went up to the library and I Googled what abortion was. And I still remember the video that I watched and the pictures that I found. I found one photograph of a baby that was probably just over 20 weeks. It looked like his head had been torn from his body. And I felt the feeling in the pit of your stomach when you're looking at something truly horrifying, looking at something just truly awful. And then I watched a video of an abortion procedure from start to finish. And it's not an exaggeration for me to say that those pictures and that video changed the course of my life, because it changed the way immediately that I viewed the country that I lived in. Because especially taking history courses, I had just been reading up, for example, on the conflict in Bosnia and Serbia in 1999. And growing up in a safe country like Canada, I would often, read through history and just feel really grateful that I lived in a country where these things didn't happen, right? That I lived in a country where people weren't murdered and thrown out into the streets. But this video, if what I was seeing was real, was an indication actually that the country I lived in might not have people get murdered and thrown into the streets like garbage. But it did have people murdered every day in clinics right across the country, and then thrown into trash cans behind clinics, behind hospitals. And it just completely transformed the way that I view my country. I couldn't really fathom the fact that 100,000 people were dying every year. And worse than that, and it was worse than that for me at least, the most innocent, the most vulnerable, the most helpless, and therefore in many ways the most beautiful, were being so cruelly destroyed. And that all of this was what was meant by the word abortion. That abortion was this word that contained within it horrors that most people had never come face to face with, and that most people didn't understand. I had made it to age 18 before really coming face to face with a victim of what abortion was. And I want to emphasize here actually that my experience is actually in no way unique. The experience of coming face to face with a victim of abortion and then having that victim, seeing that victim transform the course of your life. I found out later on that many of the pro-life leaders, especially right across North America, found themselves drawn into the pro-life movement by coming into contact with the victims of abortion. That actually they never really considered abortion. They've been pursuing other careers. Abortion hadn't been something that they considered very often. But then seeing what abortion was, but I think more specifically seeing who abortion kills, that is what transformed their view of the society around them and transformed their view of the responsibility that they have. Pro-life leader Scott Klusendorf, who many of you will recognize as the author of Pro-Life 101 and The Case for Life, once said something very interesting to me. He said, people aren't called to the pro-life movement so much as they're summoned into it. And often I discover people are summoned into this work by the victims of abortion themselves. Dr. Monica Miller, who actually took many of the original photographs of aborted babies, talks about how abortion transformed her life in her book, Abandoned, the untold story of the American abortion wars, where she describes this moment where she realizes that in a culture that kills its children, she has no right to live an ordinary life, to just do the things that she was planning to do, but that this reality that she is living through, this reality that is ending the lives of so many people, demands a response from her in some fundamental way. And she said something very profound in that book. She said that we often recognize the preborn child's right to life, which is, of course, the premise of the pro-life position, that the preborn child has the right to life. But what she said, seeing those images reminded her of the fact that those children have something else too. Those children not only have the right to life, but they have the right to our defense. That those photographs show that those children have been failed by everyone, by their parents, by the society that they live in, and by those of us who should be speaking for them and aren't. And later on in conversations with pro-life leaders, because I spent the next many, many years learning from pro-life leaders from around the world, it's still one of the favorite parts of my job, which is learning from other pro-life leaders in different countries and looking at how they deal with abortion in their countries and looking at which tactics and which strategies we can implement here in Canada as well. I found out that Joe Scheidler, who's known in the pro-life movement as the godfather of pro-life direct action, he, for example, had his life changed by seeing an image of an aborted baby. He was working in advertising when he saw a photograph of a garbage bag filled with dead babies. I remember when I heard the story from him, I recognized the photograph he was referring to because it's actually a photograph of a garbage bag filled with aborted babies in a Toronto hospital, about an hour away from here. And he said what really stood out to him was that one of the babies in that garbage bag looked identical to his son, Eric Scheidler, who actually runs Pro-Life Action League now. So one of the titans of the American pro-life movement only joined the pro-life movement after seeing an image of an aborted baby, or I should say many aborted babies. The same thing is true for Troy Newman of Operation Rescue. It was an image of an aborted baby that he saw actually on his honeymoon that transformed his view of abortion and brought him into the movement. And of course, he still runs Operation Rescue. Mark Harrington of Created Equal, they're based in Columbus, Ohio. They do phenomenal work. He as well, actually, it was his wife who showed him a picture of an aborted baby after she started working at the Crisis Pregnancy Center. And seeing that image changed his life as well, brought him out of his former career, and he joined the pro-life movement as a result. The same thing is true actually for Scott Klusendorf. He's one of the foremost apologists. He's kind of the founder of pro-life apologetics in many ways. He wrote Pro-Life 101 and The Case for Life, as I mentioned. And it was seeing a video, seeing photos of aborted babies at a presentation at a pastor's breakfast, actually, that led him to quit his previous job and then start full-time in the pro-life movement. The same thing is true, actually, of Lila Rose of Live Action. Many of you will know her as someone when she was younger used to go undercover in Planned Parenthood clinics and now runs a massive educational organization in the United States. They've produced all of these videos, these animated videos hosted by Dr. Anthony Levatino, a former abortion provider, that show what the abortion procedure looks like. She was also convicted to join the pro-life movement after seeing a photograph of an aborted baby. So we often talk actually a lot about how abortion victim photography changes the hearts and minds of people in the culture. And I'll be getting more into that in just a moment. But I wanted to pause for a moment when I explain the thing that convicted me to get involved is that my story is in no way unique. In fact, my story is extremely common. It's not only the culture that gets reshaped by coming face-to-face with the victims of the abortion industry, the pro-life movement would not exist in its current form if it wasn't for ordinary men and women coming into contact with imagery, with the reality of what abortion is, and then joining the pro-life movement as a result. It is the photographic evidence of what abortion does to preborn children that has shaped both the pro-life movement and is now shaping the culture and transforming the hearts and minds of thousands upon thousands of people. And so one of the things that I did immediately after coming into contact with these images is I joined the pro-life club at Simon Fraser University and eventually headed the club up, Simon Fraser University Students for Life. That club does still exist. I was actually on a live stream with National Campus Life Network yesterday, and the head of that club was on the live stream, learning how to bring the pro-life message to that campus. And I started volunteering. We would do poster drops. We were doing projects on campus. And then it was actually working with that campus club that I met Stephanie Gray and Jojo Ruba, the co-founders of the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform. And they invited me to do my first campus outreach with abortion victim photography. So abortion victim photography is the thing that had convicted me to join the movement. And they invited me to go to Florida on spring break, where volunteers from campuses right across the country, University of Calgary, Carleton, Thunder Bay, right across the country, and we were going to go down on spring break, in the sun, and then there was a massive display showing images of aborted babies, and we were going to engage people in conversation on this issue. And this was my first real trial by fire, debating the issue with pro-choice people in front of a massive display that was erected for the express purpose of having these conversations. And it was really an unbelievable experience. And that was the very first time that the Florida trip had been hosted. We've held it every year since then. In February, we were on campuses again, changing hearts and changing minds. Almost everybody who goes on that campus mission trip talks about how it's a life-changing experience. And the reason it's a life-changing experience is because it's an incredibly a moving experience in a lot of ways. Let me see if I can explain the impact that it has properly. So for me, we got a full day training when we got on the ground there. I learned a lot of apologetics for the first time, a lot of the apologetics that Scott Kusadorf pioneered. So we were out on campus, we're having some conversations, and I remember the first long conversation I had about abortion on campus. There was a young girl, she was probably about 19 years old. I'm standing in front of this huge display with photographs of aborted babies. And she walked by the display, and so I stick a pamphlet out and say, what do you think about abortion, to engage her in a conversation about it. And she stops and she takes her sunglasses off and she starts crying. And she says, well, I had one a couple of weeks ago. And I had absolutely no idea what to say next. I'm not a very retiring sort of person. I usually have an answer for things. And I had just spent 8 hours getting trained on pro-life apologetics. So I thought, I've got the arguments covered. I know how to explain the humanity of the preborn. I know how to explain the science of the pro-life position, exactly when life begins. I know how to explain the philosophy of personhood, to explain that the preborn child in the womb is not only a human being, scientifically speaking, but is also a person, just like you and I are persons. But it was too late for any of those arguments. And I felt like the one thing I wasn't prepared to do was to respond to somebody who was telling me that nothing that I had to say could possibly change the decision that she'd already made. Essentially, I was too late. We were all too late for her. And looking at her and looking at how heartbroken she obviously was, I just asked her, well, what do you think about these pictures then? And her answer solidified in my mind why abortion victim photography is so essential as a tool in the pro-life movement. She said, why didn't anybody show me this before? And in the hour that followed, I walked with her to class. We continued our conversation throughout the day, actually. She came back several times. And she said, if I had seen that image before my abortion, I would not have had my abortion. And I remember thinking that her sin of commission was our sin of omission. There are so many women who walk into abortion clinics every single day, and nobody has actually shown them what abortion is, explained to them what it is, showed them the humanity of their child and the horrific nature of the procedure that will destroy the life of their child in such a gruesome way. And that experience also made me realize that sometimes people will bring up, well, what about post-abortive women seeing images of aborted babies? And nothing Nothing in my activism has become more clear to me over the years and the thousands of conversations we've had face to face since that first experience, and how important it is for people to see these images, especially women who have had abortions. In many instances, and I can name, I could take the rest of this live stream just going through all the anecdotes and the stories of women who had abortions and said they would have had more abortions. In one case, I can think of a story of a woman who said she would have had 2 more abortions if they hadn't seen what abortion was like. Because what we have to remember is that the post-abortive are also pre-abortive, that once you've had 1 abortion, you're far more likely to have more. And it's our responsibility to get to them, to show them the truth, because it might be too late for one of their children, but it is not too late for any other children that they might yet be blessed with. So that experience was really powerful in showing me how necessary abortion victim photography was. And I'll get into why abortion victim photography is really at the basis of CCBR's vision in a minute. But I think one of the other really important things to highlight about my experience, because dozens upon dozens of people have had the same experience as me in the success of 10 years of CCBR's history and as our vision unfolded, is that it was an extraordinarily empowering experience. And one of, I think, the greatest risks that the pro-life movement has today is becoming cynical, is falling prey to this idea that there's nothing that we can do, that the culture is plunging downhill at a rapid rate, that abortion is always going to be with us, and that as such, it's good to do pro-life activism. It's good for people to know what our position is, to sort of offload our moral responsibility by speaking truth to the culture. But when I was out on campus for that very first time, I realized that it was absolutely false, that there was nothing that I could do. That when I came into contact with a pro-choice person, there was no reason that person was going to stay pro-choice. And there was a lot of things that I could do to change that person's mind. I watched people go from pro-choice to pro-life in a matter of minutes. Sometimes the conversations were longer. I've been in conversations that lasted more than 2.5 hours. I remember one conversation on a campus at University of Calgary, actually, where a protester who showed up to protest us with a sign. I talked to her for 2.5 hours before she ripped up her sign and changed her mind. But sometimes they change their mind in a matter of minutes. But the fundamental point here is that things do not need to be the way that they are. And that you and I can, with God's help, do something to change the status quo. That experience has been borne out for me and for my colleagues and for our volunteers and for the people who put the boots on the ground for CCBR every day. We've seen people change their minds thousands upon thousands upon thousands of times over. So the status quo does not have to remain the same, and there are things that we can do to change that status quo. And so when we look at how depressing things can be, we should see that as a challenge and as a responsibility, with the full knowledge that we can see lives saved, we can see minds changed, and that means that there are children that can be saved if we will simply show up and fulfill our responsibility to fight for those children. And so this realization that I had working on that campus and then engaging in Choice Chain on the streets of Vancouver, after that, I ended up going to the University of Calgary during my final year of university to join them on their campus for the same project, showing abortion victim photography, engaging in these conversations that led to minds being changed. And after having these experiences, it really did change my view of what my future might look like. I had multiple options for what I could do. I had 3 avenues to pursue my MA in history, which was my original plan. And then Stephanie Gray asked me if I would consider joining CCBR to begin working on a nationwide plan with the organization called the End the Killing Plan. They wanted to, in 2011, begin working on a nationwide plan to begin impacting the culture and to begin changing minds and saving lives. There was no other plan in the country that was nationwide. There was no educational organization that had a nationwide vision. There was no other organization that was seeking to bring the truth about abortion to millions of people across the country. And they asked if I would come on board to help them work with that. At the time, I ended up signing on with CCBR, as everybody watching this knows. I came on in January 2011. There were 5 of us, a bigger team by the end of that year as we were working through that plan, but there was 5 of us in January. Most of them have moved on to other pro-life work. As we know, Jojo Ruba runs a Christian apologetics organization. Stephanie Gray now is a public speaker on pro-life apologetics. So I'm the only one left of the original 5 in January 2011, but almost everybody is still involved in the pro-life movement in one form or another. But we worked on that plan throughout 2011 to put together a national plan to bring the truth about abortion that had transformed our view of our society to millions and millions of Canadians. We'd already had a truth truck running in Calgary for a couple of years. Stephanie and Jojo had launched that project several years prior. Very soon thereafter, we bought a second truth truck, which now runs in Toronto. And the organization really has exploded since then. It's sometimes surreal to me to think of where we started and then how much we've been blessed in the years since then, and how big the organization has grown. So from 5 of us in January of 2011, the team grew by the end of that year. In 2012, we launched a cross-country tour going from Vancouver all the way to Ottawa to launch our End the Killing plan, to introduce it to thousands of pro-life people across the country, and to also hit the ground in cities all the way across the country, from the coast to the capital, to show people what was going on, and to basically put the country on notice that we were no longer going to allow the culture to sleep through the greatest human rights injustice that this country has ever seen. That every day from then onwards, we were going to be confronting them with what was happening behind closed doors. And so we called that tour the New Abortion Caravan. So for those of you who know a little bit of the history of the abortion movement in Canada, you'll recognize that. So we based that project on the 1970 Abortion Caravan, which was a group of abortion activists and feminists who launched from the Vancouver Art Gallery and drove all the way across the country doing presentations, and even in church basements. The United Church of Canada supported Henry Morgentaler and the abortion movement. And they sort of launched the abortion movement that culminated in Morgentaler's activism in the 1988 R.V. Morgentaler decision 18 years later. And they went all the way across the country and then ended up at Parliament, where they shut down the House of Commons by chaining themselves to the chairs for the first time in Canadian history. They shut down Parliament. We, of course, didn't do that. But we did actually present a white coffin in Ottawa representing the 300 preborn children that were killed day by day. Hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of people from the coast to the capital came face to face with the images of abortion. And that's how we launched that tour. It's very actually interesting as a side historical note. The abortion activists were outraged by this tour. Joyce Arthur of the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada called it sacrilege because we were hijacking one of their sort of sacred historical moments. There's a new book actually that was released this week or last week called The Abortion Caravan. It's going to go through that history. I'm actually interested to see what they'll say, because one of the moments that happened, I believe it was about 8 months later, Joyce Arthur of the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada was giving a speech on the history of the abortion movement at the University of Kelowna, and she mentioned the Abortion Caravan, and one of the students put their hand up and said, "Which one?" And she snapped and she said, "The real one." And she was angry because she knew that's one of the things we were trying to do, is we were trying to redeem this history by showing, no, Canada's history is not going to be simply defined by people who fought for the destruction of the next generations of Canadians, fought for the right to extinguish preborn children in the womb. We are going to hijack that history, and we are going to ensure that if we have anything to say about it, Canada is going to be defined by young men, young women, generations of people who put boots on the ground to fight to save every single life, no matter what. And so since the caravan, to give you just a brief rundown, CCBR has really exploded beyond our wildest expectations. So from one office in Calgary, we now have an office in Vancouver, where some of my colleagues are right now. We have an office in Calgary. We have an office in Winnipeg run by Kyle Coffey, who you'll be meeting later on, who runs the Winnipeg Initiative. We also have 3 branches now in the Greater Toronto Area, as the Greater Toronto Area, of course, has 9 million of Canada's roughly 35 million people. So it's essential that we be reaching thousands upon thousands of people there. And so from the original 5 of us in January of 2011, we grew throughout 2011. By the end of that year, my colleague Carolyn Slingerland, for example, came on staff and was fundamental in getting our truck project started off here in the Greater Toronto Area. And we went from being able to reach hundreds of thousands of people in 2012 to having reached 4.5 million views of abortion victim photography around the country last year. It's been incredible to see how many people we've been able to reach, and how many people have changed their minds. We grew by about 10 times in only 5 years. And in fact, we've reached so many people now, we've attracted the attention of every major media organization in the country. They often don't have the nicest things to say about us, but they've been forced to recognize what our activism has been doing. CCBR's activism has now been mentioned in a number of books that I actually have on my shelf right here that analyze CCBR's impact on the public discourse around abortion in Canada. So there's actually a book called The Changing Voice of the Anti-Abortion Movement that talks about how CCBR's combination of social reform tactics of exposing the injustice combined with conversational apologetics on the streets, reaching out to people, having conversations even about the tough things, the hard apologetics, is really redefining what activism looks like on the streets. There was another book actually that got released by the University of Calgary. One essay in that book has a feminist academic stating that CCBR's project should be made illegal because we are, quote, impacting the public discourse on abortion, which she is worried is decreasing support for so-called reproductive rights, which of course is a code word for abortion. You'll notice, of course, that most abortion activists want to discuss anything but the word abortion. And what CCBR is dedicated to doing in the culture here is shifting the debate from choice to what is being chosen. And interestingly, we've even attracted the attention of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who loves to talk about choice and does not want to talk about what is being chosen. And he's actually called us out by name. And so we'll show you a video clip here of just one instance where Justin Trudeau mentioned us, one instance of many instances over the last couple of years where he's actually called us out by name as an organization that's attacking reproductive rights. And of course, I feel privileged to be called out by the most pro-abortion prime minister in Canadian history with attacking reproductive rights. That is the destruction of preborn human life in the womb.
This government will continue to be unequivocal. We will stand up for women's rights. We will defend women's rights and the rights of the LGBT community, regardless of what folks in certain religious groups try to push us against. You have organizations out there like the Center for Bioethical Reform that have been receiving thousands upon thousands of dollars of government money, of taxpayer money, to distribute hateful flyers of aborted fetuses to try and convince people to remove the right of a woman to control her reproductive choices. That is not something the federal government is going to fund. We are not rolling back the clock on women's rights. And I know that makes a few people upset, but there is no way government funding is going to organizations that have the specific and explicit purpose of limiting women's rights, period.
So I'll correct a few things that he said there. It's kind of interesting when he says hateful flyers of aborted fetuses. And I always wonder what somebody means by hateful flyers, because CCBR does not condemn people. We have almost all of us know people and love people who have had abortions. They're members of our circles. They're members of our family. They're members of our circles of friends. But if it's hateful to show what abortion actually is, how much more hateful is it to actually inflict that act of violence on that preborn child? And we do occupy a substantial amount of space in the Prime Minister's head on this issue, because he has brought us up a lot of times, and that is because what CCBR is successfully doing is shifting the debate from choice to what is being chosen. We want to discuss what actually happens during abortion, and of course that's the discussion that those who advocate for abortion do not actually want to have. And so moving on to discussing CCBR's vision, I want to address another question that we're very frequently asked. This is one of the most common questions I get from other pro-life leaders. We work with a lot of pro-life organizations around the world now. We get ideas from them. We share our successes with them, and we work with them to see how we can best defend preborn human rights in our respective countries. And one of the questions I get a lot is how does CCBR attract so many young people? Especially because CCBR We have our internships, multiple internships now that run in both Ontario and Alberta every year. And one of the things people want to know is, why do people always come back? Because so often we'll have somebody who does maybe a 2-month internship and comes back for a 4-month internship. And the reason for that, it goes back to the experience I had on campus, is people come back to CCBR because they have experienced how effective the strategy is. So you'll get people who say, well, what you're doing isn't effective, you're just making people angry. And I think the one of the key evidences actually that our strategy is very effective is that young people are willing to get screamed at. Young people are willing to put up with hatred from their peers. As you can see from the videos on CCBR's page, they're willing to put up with verbal abuse, in many cases physical abuse. One of the things I've written about for CCBR and we've done videos about in the last couple of years here is that there has been an increasing amount of violence leveled against pro-life activists over the last several years. This is very public. It's, videos have gone viral on Facebook of pro-life activists getting assaulted. And why, despite all of that, do young people keep on coming back? And the reason for that is because they believe it is worth it, because they see people change their minds. They have witnessed babies getting saved. In some instances, myself among them, they've gotten the opportunity to actually meet babies who were scheduled to be aborted, or mothers who were planning to abort their children and did not. And so despite the fact that it is not popular to show people what the truth about abortion is, despite the fact that our prime minister condemns it publicly, despite the fact that the media says awful things about us quite frequently, despite the fact that there is the occasional risk of people losing their temper on the streets and perhaps even threatening us, all of that is worth it when you realize that the activism and the outreach you are doing is actually resulting in the culture shifting, is actually resulting in lives saved, is actually resulting in minds changed. That is why so many young people, year after year, join CCBR's activism, despite how controversial it is in the media, despite the fact that they know people on the streets are going to scream at them. We have young people that are willing to step so far outside their comfort zone that 6 months prior to joining our internship, they couldn't imagine how they would respond in certain situations. And they're willing to do it, not just because they want to take a stand, although that's a huge part of it, not just because they believe they should say something about abortion, but although of course that's part of it too, but primarily because they experience on the streets that this strategy is effective. In short, we don't have to just do activism and do these projects and hope that what we're going to do might have an impact, right? That we're going to throw up billboards, that we're going to do pro-life activism, that we're going to put our message out there, and then just hope and pray that something is going to happen as a result of it. No, we experience firsthand the power of seeing minds change, the power of coming face to face with the victims of abortion. It's one of the most powerful tools in the pro-life arsenal. And it's important for me to note here that one of the reasons we started using abortion victim photography in the first place, and as I mentioned before, Stephanie Gray and Jojo Ruba launched the first truth truck in Calgary a couple of years before the end of Killing Plan began, is the idea of showing the culture what happens to the victims of this injustice is not our idea. We have done a lot of work, especially over the last 9 years, to amend these projects, to make them more effective, and to recontextualize how we display abortion victim photography for a 21st century a Canadian abortion context. But basically what we're doing is we are using the fundamentals of social reform. And so if you go back through the history of social reform, you realize very quickly that beginning with the very first movement that sought to change public opinion, to change hearts and minds on an issue of injustice, and I wrote about this at length in my book, talking about pro-life strategy, Seeing is Believing, why our victims must, or why the culture must face the victims of abortion. Beginning with the abolitionist movement run by Thomas Clarkson, Hannah More, William Wilberforce, they realized that only by showing people what the victims looked like would they begin to shift the culture. And that standard has remained true all the way through the history of social reform. So not only was it true for the abolitionists, but a very short time later, we have the Congo Reform Movement. There's an incredible book that I have right here on my shelf as well called King Leopold's Ghost, written by Adam Hochschild, who is one of the most eloquent and well-respected historians. And he talks about how a young shipping clerk named Edmund Morrow realized that there was a slave state and horrific human rights abuses taking place in the Congo that was run by Belgium's King Leopold. And it was by showing people the truth about what was going on in that colony that changed public opinion and forced the king to give up his colony. They did slideshows right across Great Britain with horrific images of people with arms severed, horribly mutilated faces, just absolutely horrific images. And it was these images that shocked the conscience of the nation and eventually forced the king to give up his colony. This is true also for the civil rights movement in the United States, which was triggered by an image of a murdered young boy in 1955, the 14-year-old Emmett Till, who was cruelly beaten to death and finally shot in the head. It was photographs of his open casket funeral that launched the civil rights movement, which was then propelled onwards to success by images of people being beaten to the ground, by being attacked by dogs, hammered up against walls, by fire hoses. Right? Child labor practices in the United States were transformed by the photographs taken by Lewis Hine of mutilated children in factories, of children who were just fatigued, beleaguered, broken beyond belief by the work that they were put through, by children being forced to work the jobs that only full-grown men and women actually could work. And there's so many different examples I could use. In my book, I list more than a dozen different historical movements that use imagery. And it's also true still today. Here in Canada, consider the debate in the 2015 election surrounding the election between Stephen Harper and the current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. That entire debate on immigration and migration and refugees, for example, was transformed by a horrifying photograph of a drowned little boy washed up on a beach. And the power of that image completely eradicated people's objections. It transformed the discussion because when you see a picture like that, it transforms the way you think. When you change the way somebody feels, it changes the way that people think about things. The same tactic is still used not just in social reform, but also in behavior modification. Everything from anti-smoking to anti-drinking and driving to anti-drug campaigns. You name it, imagery is always used to reach people's hearts, to show them what's going on as to transform their views. And so CCBR didn't invent the tactic of confronting the culture with the victims. We merely adopted it from every successful social reform movement from 1767 until the present day. As Abraham Lincoln once said, history serves to remind us that our new ideas aren't new and aren't ours. I remember thinking one of the projects that we had come up with was our idea, only when I was doing more research to discover that Lewis Hine had pioneered an almost identical project, but with photographs of child labor victims instead of abortion victims almost 100 years before CCBR came up with the idea. And so we launched the strategy, we based the strategy on tactics that were already proven before we launched them in the first place. And then were also proven by pro-life leaders in the United States like Ray Cunningham and so many other pro-life leaders who use the same tactics, like Mark Harrington of Creative Equal, and etc. And we've also been very, very careful to ensure that we never use the same projects just because we've done them last year. We diligently poll test our projects to ensure that they are having an impact, to ensure that every donor dollar that goes into our projects has a measurable impact on Canadian views of abortion. So we've run now like 3 major nationwide polling tests since 2013. In every single poll that we've done, we found that more than 30% of the people who view a picture of an abortion victim shifts their view on abortion. We found the group of people most likely to shift their mind is actually women over between the ages of 18 and the mid-30s, which of course is one of the primary groups that we would like to reach with this message to show them what abortion looks like before they might make that decision themselves. In our most recent data set, over 65% of people who simply saw an image of an aborted baby, excuse me, shifted to a more negative view of abortion simply because of what they saw. So this is without CCBR's conversations, which of course a huge part of our internships are dedicated to training people with pro-life apologetics. Our pro-life apologetics have really evolved over the last 10 years as we've amended our arguments based on what works best and most effectively on the streets. We use arguments now that we didn't use back in 2012, and we don't use arguments now that we used to use in 2012, arguments that we've realized aren't as effective, that aren't reaching the younger generation as effectively. And the same thing is true actually even for our postcards. We've delivered millions of them door to door. We've changed our postcard designs now over a dozen times, based on data, based on feedback, based on analyzing what works best. So we don't just simply use abortion victim photography and the same apologetics we've always used. We're constantly changing, revising, amending, and making sure that what we are doing is constantly relevant, that we're shifting with the culture. But the crux of our strategy, which is confronting a visual culture with the visual reality of what abortion is still the linchpin of what we do. And the data has proven to us that even without a conversation, even without the statistical evidence of how many lives abortion costs us every year, just seeing that image transforms so many people's view of abortion. We have people who say they're still pro-choice but could never have an abortion because they saw that image. We've gotten phone calls to the phone number on the sides of our truth trucks from people who said they canceled their abortion because of what they saw on the truck. And so even during this coronavirus lockdown, we still have the truth truck and the truth trucks on the streets. We're still ensuring that people are seeing abortion before they get into the abortion clinic. And we know, not just because we have circumstantial evidence that images change minds, we know because we have done polling on these projects, that these projects are having a real world impact, because we feel that we are responsible first and foremost for the babies at risk of dying from abortion. We are first and foremost of them to be in between them and the clinics to the extent that we can, to be there with a message that could save their lives. And second of all, we are also responsible to the generous donors who have made this work possible through their donations. We feel responsible to ensure that every dollar that we receive from donors has a measurable impact on the culture. That we're not going back to our supporters and simply saying, no, we think this works because it's worked in the past. We think this works because sometimes people change their minds. No, this works because we've hired independent polling agencies and then have the data from them, not analyzed by us, where confirmation bias is a risk, but analyzed by a statistician, a PhD in statistics from the US, who's unaffiliated by our group, who sent us back a report explaining exactly what the impact our imagery was having. And so we are now confident that what we are doing is having an impact because, of course, we didn't choose to work full-time on the pro-life movement just to be out on the streets day after day and not making an impact. But also we feel very responsible both to the children that we are seeking to save and also to the donors who are making that possible through their financial support. So I just want to emphasize that CCBR's vision is based on tried and true tactics, but we're constantly analyzing what we do to make sure that what we are doing is of maximum effectiveness. So I want to address one more point on CCBR's vision, because I think it's the thing people are the most frequently confused about, which is the difference between marketing and social reform. So a lot of people will say, I understand, right? It's a visual culture and we need to have a visual message to reach a visual culture, especially today. Fewer people read, people are driven by visuals. The whole advertising industry is based on the premise that people will change their behavior based on what you show them. That's marketing, right? Marketing is attracting people to something, to showing people something beautiful, tempting them to buying it, right? And so there's a lot of groups that will say, why don't you just use beautiful pictures of children in the womb? And I'll start by saying that we have beautiful pictures. We have some of the most high definition embryological photos available today that are used on both our signs, in our pamphlets, and on our postcards that get delivered door to door. So we do use those images as well. But the difficulty is people will say, well, the pictures that you use of aborted babies turn people off. And they will judge social reform tactics by marketing standards and saying, you're turning people off, that's a problem, without realizing that there's a big difference between social reform and marketing. So the intent of social reform is to turn people away, to turn people off of an injustice. So the reason that the abolitionists used imagery of the slave trade was to turn them off of that injustice, to tear the mask off that injustice. But they didn't just use pictures of happy and healthy families that had been liberated into freedom. They used horrific images of what was taking place inside slavery, right? It's the same thing with education on all sorts of injustice. The tactics of social reform are designed to repel people away from something. So when somebody says, yeah, but showing somebody an image of an aborted baby is repelling them, I'm like, that is precisely what this tactic is intended to do. That is what we are trying to do. I've got messages from abortion activists as far away as Prince Edward Island who say, I hate your messages because they turn people off of abortion. which is exactly what we're doing. I have met pro-choice people who say, I'm still pro-choice. I don't like your arguments. I hate your pictures, but I couldn't get that picture out of my head. And when I became pregnant, I decided not to have an abortion because I saw that picture. It's why, interestingly, I'll just give you a side example here. Joyce Arthur of the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada always says, these images hurt their cause, they turn people off, and we should make them illegal. Well, I'm sorry. If CCBR's images were gaining support for the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada, she should be encouraging us as much as possible. In fact, she should be donating to CCBR right now, because if we are helping her cause and making people more pro-choice, then obviously she should be CCBR's #1 fan. Of course, the reason she isn't is because she is fully aware that when we focus the debate on what is being chosen rather than choice, we tear away all the flimsy rhetoric she uses to disguise the massive pile of corpses that her ideology has resulted in this culture. And that is why she both says our images help her cause, and then simultaneously argues that our images should be kept off the streets, which I'm sure you can all see as a schizophrenic possession. And so what we have found at CCBR is that people have a cognitive dissonance between what they know instinctively and intellectually about the baby in the womb and what they believe ideologically about abortion. So let me give you an example. There's a lot of people have the premise that people simply don't know that the baby in the womb is a baby. That is largely not true in our experience. Almost everybody has seen a sonogram, a ultrasound, a picture in Life magazine, Time magazine, or National Geographic documentary. This is proven by the fact that when somebody says they're pregnant, nobody ever asks them what they're expecting. They know it's a baby, right? When somebody sees a friend's ultrasound who's happy about being pregnant, nobody ever questions that that ultrasound is in fact of their son or daughter. However, they become mysteriously amnesiac about that information the second abortion enters into the conversation. So the difficulty is when we only show them a picture of a baby in the womb, we are confirming what they already know without challenging what they ideologically believe. Because there's this cognitive dissonance between what they know instinctively or intellectually about the baby in the womb versus what they ideologically believe about abortion and about choice. And so when we just show them an image of a beautiful baby in the womb, it confirms what they already know without challenging what they believe. It's like they see it, they recognize it, but they've all seen pictures of babies in the womb before. So you will get a few people once in a while who might just see that image and that's good enough for them. But that's not, in our experience, the majority of people. Because it's not news to them that a baby in the womb at 20 weeks looks like that. It's just news to them because they've never applied the obvious reality of what they believe about abortion to what they know about the baby in the womb. That's why, just to give you an example, we have legal affidavits that actually confirm the authenticity of our images. Our images come from reputable sources, and their veracity has actually been challenged in court, and the images have been proven to be authentic. But even aside from that, when I don't often pull up the legal affidavits when somebody challenges the authenticity of our images, which, by the way, every social reform movement through history has had the authenticity of their images challenged, because when opposition has no tactic left, when truth isn't available to them, they have to grasp the lies. That's just the way it works. So what we do, what I often do is I just point out, imagine the last photograph of an ultrasound, a sonogram, a photograph of a baby in the womb. Imagine the last one you saw. And when you tell somebody to imagine something, it does pop into their head. And I say, now imagine what that baby would look like once the abortion is through. And the result will be a graphic image in their head, because they'll suddenly realize that the process of dismantling, crushing, and evicting that child from the womb has to, by definition, be gruesome. That you can't apply forceps or a suction aspirator to a child that looks like a child without that child being hideously dismembered, disfigured, and destroyed. And so one of the reasons CCBR needs abortion victim photography is because we are employing the tactics of social reform, not just the tactics of marketing. And the reason we contrast babies in the womb with babies who have been aborted is because it's the only way to truly reach the vast majority of people with the truth about abortion. Social reform tactics are necessary to turn people off of abortion and to deter them from it. And in our experience, through our research and thousands upon thousands, tens of thousands of conversations at this point collectively on our team, we have recognized that simply showing people a picture of a baby in the womb is not enough most of the time to challenge their worldview and to truly expose what abortion actually is. And I'll point out here, if there was an easier way to end abortion, if there was an easier way to change minds, if there was an easier way to deter people from having abortions, we would absolutely do it, right? We are not doing this work because it's enjoyable to have somebody yell at you or call you names or trash you, write horrible things about you in the newspaper or misrepresent you on the radio and the TV. We don't do that because it's enjoyable. We do it because it's worth it. We do it because all of the garbage that gets thrown at us by abortion activists like Joyce Arthur, who are attempting to maintain Canadians in their delusion that abortion is reproductive health care and that abortion isn't an act of violence that kills a developing child in the womb. We do it because we see people change their minds, because we've met children who have changed their minds. I have held in my hands over the past 10 years both babies that have been torn apart and discarded in dumpsters. I still have the sensory memory in my hands of holding little children who have been destroyed by abortion and holding a child who was scheduled to be aborted at a clinic and was not. And just the difference in the sensory memory between a child who was limp, lifeless, dead, destroyed, and then the recognition that nobody actually in our culture will admit that as a child if abortion comes up. And that it is our job to bring those children face to face with a country, with a people, with a public who want to deny that he or she ever existed, that he or she was ever a person just like you or I, that he or she was ever a valuable member of our society, not only with the right to life that was brutally violated, but with the right to our defense, that he or she was denied in the moment that they needed it most. And by showing people these images, we deny them their illusions. And that is why so often people get angry when they see these images. Because people would like to sleepwalk through the greatest human rights abuse that we have seen. And our goal at the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform is to deny people the right to peacefully ignore the mounting pile of corpses, more than 4 million destroyed preborn children since 1969. That mounting pile of corpses, we as activists that are responsible both to the babies and to the supporters who are helping us to do this work, is to drag the attention of the public time and time and time again to these victims who cannot speak for themselves and say, this is who they are. This is what they look like. These are their faces. And we do not have the right to ignore them. We do not have the right to live a peaceful life while hundreds of children every day are destroyed in the most gruesome way imaginable. In a culture where the Prime Minister can not only come out and say abortion is an essential service, and more than that, so many representatives of the abortion industry came out and said the reason abortion is an essential service when we're shutting down cancer screenings, when we're shutting down all these other essential surgeries. McLean's talked about how people were having essential surgeries related to cancer treatment shut down, but abortion is essential because they said it's time sensitive. And I thought that when they said it was time sensitive, they actually revealed a lot more than they wanted to. Because the reason abortion is time sensitive is because in almost every instance, unless the child has a fetal abnormality and may not survive birth, and then even in those instances, it is absolutely not the right response to that situation to have that child destroyed. But in almost every instance, if that abortion was delayed for too long, a living baby, a little boy or a little girl would get born. And the moment that child exited the womb here in Canada in a living form, the mantle of human rights would magically descend on that child, and suddenly that child would be protected under law. Because in Canada, it's legal to kill babies at the same age that they survive outside the womb. It's legal to kill them at the same age that in many countries they're doing surgeries on babies in utero. And as a result, what we see is that people are willing to deny all these facts. And this is essentially what CCBR's vision is. So to sort of recap our vision before I turn this back over to my colleague Lorena, CCBR's vision is to reach millions upon millions of Canadians with the truth about abortion, to change hearts and minds, and to see lives saved as a result, to see children spared from one of the most gruesome fates that exists in a civilized society, because abortion is an uncivilized and barbaric act that exists in the present for no good reason. Every bit of scientific evidence has shown us who the preborn are And every scientific evidence has been denied by abortion activists as irrelevant to their fictitious right to have that child killed in the womb. And what CCBR's vision is to save lives by denying our culture the illusion that we live in a nation where everybody is protected. Because at the end of the day, we live in a country where not all human beings are protected, where not all children are protected, and it is our job to protect them. So at this point, if there's any questions, I've got about a couple of minutes here left. If there's no questions, I'll share a couple of stories about successes that we've seen. Let me check here.
You here and bring up one of the questions that came up. We've got, how do you see the future of the pro-life movement now as the battle seems yet harder?
So it's kind of interesting because a lot of people say the battle is harder on the political front. And politics is constantly changing. Politics is something that, we obviously agree that people should be involved in getting pro-life candidates elected. But what CCBR's perspective is that it's our job to be on the front lines, changing hearts and minds. CCBR's work of saving lives and changing minds is irrelevant. I should say who the prime minister is irrelevant to our work. We say that the politicians, yes, they have a responsibility and they will be accountable to that responsibility in terms of protecting preborn children. But it is liberating to say it is our responsibility to stand up for these children. We have seen this work get blessed. We know that this work is effective because it's been tried and proven true. And so for me, I find it's easy not to lose hope when we see hearts and minds get changed every single day. And that's one of the reasons I would encourage people to focus on changing hearts and minds rather than exclusively looking to our leaders to change things. Because at the end of the day, when you see things change on the streets, when you see things change amongst your peers, it's a lot easier to say that even if the battle is hard, the children are worth fighting for no matter how hard the battle is. The children we are seeking to rescue are worth it, and we still have been blessed to see those lives being saved. So as long as we see children being saved and minds being changed, as hard as the battle gets, it's still infinitely worth it because each of those children is infinitely precious. Any other questions?
We've got some great comments in here. Mike is sharing about the new resource, the book that you have coming out about Ireland's Last Patriots. Do you want to give a quick intro to that?
Yeah, we'll have a book probably coming out in the fall. The schedule is a little bit up in the air based on the current pandemic we're all living through together. But it's basically, I researched a lot of other pro-life movements and organizations around the world to see what CCBR can learn from them. And this research project into how Ireland kept abortion up for 35 years and saved nearly 250,000 preborn lives in that time ended up turning into a book. I was writing up a report on exactly what we could learn from them, and it turned into me just writing out the whole story. And so I've been working with the Irish pro-lifers. I was working with them this morning on it, and that story will be released sometime. There will be an announcement coming when we finally get the schedule nailed down, because things have been kind of in flux due to the lockdown, shifting publishing schedules, things like that. But yeah, there's so many incredible stories of how lives have been saved despite overwhelming challenges, and just to consider the hundreds of thousands of people that are alive today. Because pro-lifers were out in the front lines, getting in between them and the clinics, in between them and the abortion industry. I think that people should sometimes spend more time considering that, because when you realize that every human life is infinitely precious, you realize it would have been worth fighting for 10 years to save one. And we have been blessed to see countless saved. And it really is extraordinary when you sit down and you think about it for a minute.